I'm very glad to be here with you today. And I'd like to start by thanking the Latin American and the Caribbean Studies Program, especially Bill Freeland, thank you, Bill, and Ernesto Bassett also, and in particular to Matias Flores, who is the primary responsible of my dialogue, of this dialogue we are beginning tonight. Secondly, I would like to ask your permission to read the presentation, because I'm afraid that my limitations in spoken English may reduce too much the repertoires of words and ideas presenting our communication. So I will read with some support of some slides, and I hope we can understand and have a dialogue after. As Matias said, the university extension is a tradition that in Latin America are particularly developed. As the land movement, university extension also emerged as a movement. And I think it is very interesting to note this aspect, because a movement is not a theory, nor a methodology, nor an institutional mission, although it can summon theories and repertories of action to carry out a university mission. From this base, in this conversation, I will make a brief tour of the historical process of university extension in Latin America, trying to think of some questions. What subjects, pedagogical conceptions, and political orientations articulated the university extension in Latin America in different historical periods from the beginning of the 20th century to the present? Or rather, what subjects, pedagogical and epistemological conceptions, and what meanings and political orientations were stressed, antagonized, or articulated in the production of university extensionism in plural in Latin America? I think these questions might help us to reflect about the challenges of the relations between university and society in our present. So let's start with the beginnings. The beginnings, in this case, in this genealogy I will share with you, are in England. So before coming to Latin America, let's see how in the European genealogy the university extension emerged, and it was in the University of Oxford and Cambridge in the 1870s. And it emerged from the combination of two simultaneous processes: the reform of the university under the influence of the German model and the consolidation of modern system of public education by the state's literacy concern in the context of the Industrial Revolution. Extension was the way in which the reformed modern universities were incorporated into the movement to expand literacy and culture throughout society. The pedagogical optimism of the Enlightenment and the promises of progress positivism formed the cultural substrate of this original extensionism. Its initial forms were the conferences of vulgarization of university knowledge, the summer meetings, and each campaigns in large urban centers. The type of relationship was paternalistic. As Pablo Carlevaro points out, the students reproduced with society the type of pedagogical link they had in classrooms. Its first audience was made up of two sectors of society excluded from the university education. That were workers and women. Here in this slide we can see this is a supplement that was from 1887, so a few years later, the beginnings of the university extension movement. We can see how quick this movement was developed. A few years later, the people who attended the lectures were more than 2,000. And the subjects were very much, no? And here is this gender uh, difference between the preference of the audience, no? As this chronist point of view. But I think this slide is also interesting because allow us to see that university extension, first than offer of education to, for example, workers and in this case women, was a result of a movement of women that has started before. No, as here says, the Lay Educational Association started in 1878 to pressure the universities to offer some educational opportunities. So I think that in its origin, the extension seems to have been at the same time a conquest of the women's movement as well as an institutional containment on the British University, which in the case of Oxford only accepted women in 1920. Not in Edinburgh that was before, but in Oxford, the first lady that could study as a regular student was Bella Brittain, this woman in the photo, she became later a famous writer in England. So these were the characteristics of this first university extension. And as it is spread through Europe first and through Latin America later, this original extensionism was diversifying its forms and was piercing the world borders of the 19th century universities. The University of Oviedo in Spain was located in Asturias, which is an area with large coal mines. The university extension acquired an orientation focused on the working class, from a liberal perspective that could be summarized in this quote by Don Rafael Altamira, the famous Valencian professor who took over the Oviedo University Extension department in 1892. Altamira is the first one here. In 1901, Altamira wrote that the main mission of university extension with reference to workers is to raise the spirit, open new horizons, dignify them, put them in a position to like and taste the great source of intelligence that give life greater chance and compensate for the monotonous and ultimately brutalizing repetition of an almost invariable mechanical work. Altamira was a great diffuser of Latin American university. In this photo, we can see him with Justo Sierra and Ezequiel Chavez, who were the two who founded the Mexican University in 1910. Were two positivist intellectuals of Mexico. But before arriving to Mexico, Altamira did a trip all around Latin America, from Montevideo, Buenos Aires, Córdoba, all the cities with big universities. And in each city, he did two main conferences. The first one, where in his topics he worked, it was the law of philosophy, or the historical law system in Spain. And the second one was about university extension. The university extension were, at that time, something like pedagogical innovation, we would say today. University extension appears only in the main Latin American universities. It can be seen mentioned in the law of creation of universities in La Plata, Argentina, Mexico, where in addition to the influence of European cultural extension, Altamira also have weighed the experience of the land grant University of California, which was one of the patrons of the foundation of the Mexican University. Extension also appears in the first International Congress of American Students held in Montevideo in 1908. At that time, the extension appears as a replica it's in English or maybe it's in Spanish, as a photo, as a photograph, as the same, as a copy of the European model.
Es un diseño.
No, it's a copy. Like reflect the same model put into a different place. But shortly after arriving in Latin America, the university extension lived a double process of redefinition and politicization. Politicization not in the sense of the party policies, but in terms of commitment with social issues. From its incorporation as part of the program of the university reform process known as the Córdoba Reform of 1918, even though it did not begin in Córdoba, Argentina, not in 1918, but that is how fluid is the time and space of the Latin American experience. Now, out of such redefinition and politicization arose a new kind of extensionism of reformist matrix, different from its predecessor. In fact, I believe that replicating the analysis of Adriana Puigros, which is an Argentinian researcher, she says that, thinking on the effects of, she says that the pedagogical thought of Paulo Freire did a dislocation of the hegemonic modern pedagogical discourses in Latin America, which was selected from the Sarmiento's opposition between civilization and barbarism. This is what Puigros said, no? Paulo Freire did this dislocation in these two pedagogical discourses. Paraphrasing this idea, I think we could say that the Córdoba reform of university movement produced a dislocation of the original European extensionist discourse in its dominant versions, linking him to a plot of emancipatory conceptions. To account for this process, one must consider the characteristics of the reformist movement. As Natalia Bustelo has pointed out, the novelty that Córdoba produced is that it enrolled the student movement within the genealogy of Latin American popular movements, overcoming the political socialization of the predominantly patriotic or oligarchic profile of university students until then. A way to better visualize the tenor of the change pointed out by Bustelo, I think we can find it in literature. Horacio Quiroga, I don't know if you know him, he's a Uruguayan writer. He, with this quote, I think we can say how he represented to himself how the students were and the deep sense of the change of this profile, student profile in the university that was changing at the time. Horacio Quiroga, the famous Uruguayan writer, wrote in 1920, while living in Buenos Aires, a text called The Awakening, in which he narrated the surprise caused by the visit of students committed to the reform. He wrote, "Nothing has been sadder to us in the last 10 years than to see the indifference, the dryness, and the narrow-mindedness of university youth, whose only concern following the moral disaster that and it was how to pronounce it. Liquid, thank you. Liquid, to us, the word was to burnish and to polish their nails with a beautiful and intelligent head dropped toward the heart.
Una palabra pesada.
Yes. This vision of love changed. Now with these reformist students who arrived to his home, and Quiroga thus narrates his impression. It flowed from those 4 boys, and not drop by drop, but spurts, such an amount of indignant love, such generous enthusiasm, and that the one who heard them began to think of the strange God who took pity after the honor of young Argentines, and finally flooded the dead heart of college students with the red and pure blood. The dead heart. So he wasn't expecting anything from students. The truth is that, as an expression of the deep changes that were taking place in Latin American societies, the emergence of the reformist student movement was an event of such magnitude that Dardo Cunio equated it in importance to the independence feats of the 19th century and the continental currents of literary modernism of the late 19th century. They all three as part of the genealogy of Latin American identity and cultural affirmation. The reformist students' generation, grown in the heat of Russian Revolution and before the Mexican Revolution, in a context of social and demographic transformations that incorporated sectors of the middle strata into the university and put the 19th century university in crisis. In this political framework of questioning the oligarchic republics, there was the process of political radicalization that linked the university reform with the social reform, as proclaimed intellectuals such as Mariátegui, Aníbal Ponce, Julio Antonio Vega, Juan Lasarte, or Carlos Quijano, among many others. In this context, there was this movement that had varied and sometimes even contradictory expressions, but that, as far as the university was concerned, fought for a democratization in several levels: internal, with the co-government of the university, the autonomy, the freedom of professorships, teaching competition, etc., and external, free and open access, university extension, research linked to national realities, etc., which began by criticizing the role of the university as formators of the rallying elites of Latin American nations. This democratization was the same time a modernization of very backward institutions, a modernization linked to Latin American conception that called for the development of science and cultural creation according to local and regional contexts. In this context, the conditions were more than conducive, thanks, for the university extension to take root in fertile soil. One of the teachers of the reformist, the positivist Professor José Ingenieros, wrote in 1920, the new ideal manifests itself as a tendency to increase the social function of culture, which should not be seen as a luxury of entertainment to entertain idlers, but as an instrument capable of increasing the well-being of men on the planet they inhabit. Whereas higher education was a monopoly reserved for the privileged classes, it was explained that the university lived in cloistered conditions and outside the rhythm of the vital problems that kept society in perpetual dispute. Science was reserved for a few specialists. The issue nowadays tends to change substantially. Universities begin to take care of matters of great social importance, and the sciences are conceived as instruments applicable to the improvement of the various techniques necessary to the life of the people. The Latin American university reform was an heterogeneous movement. the most radicalized sectors of the reform, it was conceived that there was a class called upon to transform society, and that class had to be given the theoretical elements and technical training so that it could fulfill its mission of leading the political, economical, and cultural process. If in the quote of Altamira we saw some minutes ago, remember this one, the, the liberal extension oriented to worker in Oviedo, that we saw some minutes ago, the role of the extension was to caution or alleviate the rigors of situations of exploitation and alienation whose overcoming was not on their own. Now the task of the university was to contribute to the end of the oppression, as we can see in this letter sent by the students of Ariel Center in Uruguay to the Uruguayan Regional Workers' Federation in June of 1920. Comrade, just the beginning is different. The Student Center Ariel is pleased to let you know that in one of its last meetings, the board of directors has decided to organize a series of family conversations in various workers' premises in the capital, in Montevideo, that will deal with matters of science, arts, current affairs, etc., which will be run by students from different colleges. The Ariel Center considers that, together with men who want, should go men who know the knowledge and mental orientation, emotion and selfless truth next to the arm of a firm and superior will. He understands that the collaboration with men specialized in mental disciplines must be made effective in the social work, that the work of the intelligence it creates must be cordially allied to the manual work it performs. He believes, with ingenieros, recently, that all our aspirations aim to ensuring the free expansion of the individual within society are summed up in a concept, solidarity, and tend to a result, justice. In turn, as a common element to the entire ideological arc of the reformist movement, influenced by the thinking of intellectuals such as Jean-Michel Rodot and Santiago Gasset, the limits of partial and utilitarian professional training were questioned, while a culturally broad and socially sensitive formation was demanded, as well as a scientifically rigorous. They claimed enough of professionals without moral sense, enough of pseudo-aristocrats of thought, no more license and merchants. Science for all, beauty for all. University of tomorrow will be without doors, without walls, open as a space large. From the multiple conformation of the reformist movement and the set of meanings and senses that it put into circulation to understand the university problem as part of the social problem, is that I believe that we can distinguish three great branches of the university extension of reformist matrix to Latin America. First, extension as a link with the subaltern sectors of society, whether organized as social organizations, health unions, farmers' unions, new social movements, etc., or unorganized communities, territories. This branch was initially called extension, simply, then popular extension or critical extension or other subnames. Second, extension as an orientation of science to the study of great national problems, taking the expression of reformist students. A strand that linked research with application context oriented to address productive and social problems from sovereign science policies, countering the dependent condition of third world countries. This strand finds today a very important expression in many Latin American authors. Third, the branch that put in first place the pedagogical importance of extension, understanding it as a means to remedy the partial character of professional formation of universities of positive heritage, and to favor a more integral formation to include the ethical, humanist, and social dimension. In these three branches, we can locate many of the main developments of the university extension as it was formed in Latin America in the 20th century. The popular universities, for example, the González Prada in Peru, José Martí in Cuba, but also in Mexico and in Uruguay, were very important with a very large history and with they attended many thousands of people, especially workers class people. The cultural missions, as they were called in Mexico in the 20s, or socio-pedagogical missions, as they were called in Uruguay in the 40s. Civil or university social service, for example, in Mexico since the 30s, is a very important program that involves the 100% of the students, university students in the country. University programs of scientific and technical support to productive modernization, contribution to health systems, urban development, environmental care, education, among other aspects. Territorial support programs for local development and community participation in urban and rural areas. Programs to support the cooperative and self-management organizations of production. The students practice different types and formats oriented in a sense of integral information, citizen awareness campaigns, and contributions to the public debate from the arts, humanities, and scientific dissemination, programs of popular education with social organization, among many others kinds of activities. By the way, the traditional methods of dissemination, conference, summer courses, etc., continue to exist. The discussion more recent in time on the models of extension, if authoritarian or dialogic, if welfare or transformative, is transversal to these three branches and the whole. And from these different currents, often coupled or condensed, emerge a constellation of practices and ideas that, associated with different disciplinary and professional traditions, produced multiple extensionisms that brought into play meanings and sense that were different from the original extensionism arrived from Europe. A social transformative intentionality, a critique of the idea of neutrality of science, a vocation to transcend technical solutions and also to address the transformation of social relations, looking for the self-management of society, a criticism of university vanguardism, among others. In the USA. Beginning in the mid-20th century, in the context of the post-war transformation of the American university, in the sense of its corporatization and organic link with industry, the emergence of the theory of human capital by Schultz and Weber and the growing hegemony of development theories, there's an Argentinian author, Cano, who speaks of a climate of generic developmentalism, within which all philosophical and political debates began. This context will produce new meanings for university extension. The theory of the diffusion of innovations, whose main exponent was the sociologist Ebert Rogers, became dominant in the field of rural extension. Based on Rostov's idea about economic development, this conception conceived that overcoming the critical conditions of rural society, poverty, problems, access to education, housing, etc., depended on the capacity of the backward sectors to adopt the new ideas. This is to say, to become innovative actors capable of adopting the technologies and inputs that modify their production system according to the advance and the export of the North American industry. This model was strongly promoted in Latin America by the US cooperation, mainly through the USAID and the Alliance for Progress. In a Cold War context in which such cooperation fulfilled, in addition to its economic role, also a role of social control in this context. I choose this cover of the Levy book because in this book he calls the Golden Age, no? He addressed the different kinds of cooperation policies. And I think that this box, say in Chile, is very illustrative because Chile was a laboratory of some neoliberal experiments. And Levy, in the introduction of his book, he wrote, during the second half of the 20th century took place the most ambitious and organized non-military effort in modern history to export progress. Non-military effort to export progress, because there are other ways to export progress. Providing resources, ideas, and experience to the least developed countries, enabling them to make a leap forward. Criticizing this model of rural extension of technology transfer, Paulo Freire wrote his book, Extension or Communication, first published in 1971. There, he formulated a multiple objection of the dominant rural extensionism, as ignorance of popular knowledge, as cultural invasion, as technocratic messianism, and as a reproduction of domination. He pointed out in this way that the transference concept of extension contained a sociological misunderstanding. Since the world is known and transformed through the protagonism of men or women in situations, in the contradictory process of the praxis, and not from an artificial situation of passivity that reduces the subjects to a condition of mere recipients of technologies and knowledge. Freire's proposal was articulated with critical theories of the developmentalism, such as the dependency theory, liberation theology, and Latin American expressions of post-May French pedagogical self-management theories, to lay the foundations of the extensionist critical conceptions proper to the 60s and 70s. Meanwhile, since mid-century, in some cases before, as the reformist movement was achieving conquest and transforming the university, the extension was institutionalized to form the missionary triad of the Latin American universities. Along with this process, it begins to appear as a specific topic of continental meetings and a regional networks, such as the Conference of Latin American Universities Union, and closer in time, the Latin American and Caribbean Union of University Extension, among other exciting networks. With the end of the century, along with the emergence of the paradigms such as the knowledge society and the university model of the triple helix of Edgewood and Leaderson, the transference traditions of the tradition of the extension will have a new version of the hand of the model of linkage university business. This model, by its characteristics, operates in the sense of a removal of the critical sense of extension, and in its redefinition as an instrument for the adaptation of university to the demands of economic globalization, which requires, in the first place, the own management of universities as companies. The linkage alters the altruistic sense, more or less politicized or welfare according to historical context, as the extensionist model, proper of Latin American extensionists, formed in the 20th century and introduces a new radically different sense of comparative advantages and economic opportunism. At this point, we can correct the title of this conversation and call it Culture, Nation, People, and Market. That was too long to But I would like to be clear that this is not a sequence of stages or moments that happened, each surprising its previous. Instead, I have stopped at certain contexts, yeah?
Junctures.
Thank you, of events that produced, articulated, or redefined the university extension in a dynamic of selective traditions, like Raymond Williams said, in a plot of diagrammed by hegemonic disputes and alternative projects. I like this idea of Roberto Rodriguez, who thinks the extension notion as a palimpsest. Palimpsest is a manuscript of recent writing material in which the original writing has been effaced to make room for later writing, but of which traces remain. And the traces that remain can always help us with the new scriptures, the new writings that we must realize. What does the social commitment of university means in the 21st century, when of the 100 largest economic entities in the world, more than 2/3 are companies and only 1/3 are states? When knowledge is subject to the dynamics of appropriation, concentration, and exclusion from capitalist globalization, rather than the luminous, lighting promises of the knowledge society. When some multinationals have, or some companies have more scientists than many countries, when the humanist project of enlightenment has been displaced by the techno-science economics of management, when the neoliberal counter-reform of the university commodifies from the administration to the curricula, the research agendas, the extension policies, putting them in competition in markets and reshaping the academic profession towards a competitive regime of economic stimuli for productivity. Above all, it means this commodification of knowledge power relations at all levels, university society relations, the ways in which we think and the grammar with which we produce the university. It is about defending the public and deepening the idea of the common. For this, the legacy of the Reformist genealogy of extension invites us to try a new articulation of the three mentioned branches: the study of the great national problems that links research with extension around an agenda of problems of sovereign development, critical extension along with social movements, classical organizations, and new movements, as well as the territorial programs that expand the community capillarity of the university by urban or rural areas postponed by great national solutions, and the integral formation of the students in the different experiences of extension, research, teaching. In this new articulation, university extension is a logic, a movement from within a field of knowledge operating through certain organizational and methodological devices, while also involving a complementary movement, and in the opposite sense of what Diego Tatian calls university intention, as the incorporation of knowledge and priorities of the movements to the curricular research agenda of the university. A beloved Uruguayan teacher, Pablo Carlevaro, used to say, "We want a university that is always changing and that nevertheless remains always the same at the same." in this dialectic, we must place our relationship with the legacy of the reformist university extension. Thanks.